This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, a weekly vlog series I do where I talk about Limited, usually the current Limited format. Right now we're talking about Innistrad Midnight Hunt. We are getting close to the end of the format, but we're not quite there yet. In last week's video, I talked about 10 cards in the set that I see people playing that they just shouldn't be playing, like Stuffed Bear, for example. And in this video, we're kind of doing the opposite. I'm going to talk about 10 cards that I think people are underrating. Cards that I see go way too late in draft, even at higher tiers on Magic Arena, and I'm just surprised to see them there. I'm going to talk about why I think these cards are a little better than the general people tend to think of the card as, based on drafts and things like that I've done. So yeah, sort of the opposite, sort of more optimistic instead of pessimistic about cards. So let's go ahead and get started. So first up, I want to talk about Lunar Veteran. This is a nice little card, and it's kind of an interesting one in terms of how it's moved around in the format. When the format began, a lot of people thought it was terrible. Then for a while, it seemed like everyone thought it was great, and now it's sort of somewhere in the middle. It's not really terrible, and it certainly isn't. It's especially good in blue-white, but I like it in virtually any white deck, whether you're in green-white or black-white or whatever. I like it because you get two bodies out of it for one card, and that's always really nice. All these things with Disturb are, significantly better than they look. And this one's a little harder to get 2-for-1s with because both sides are a 1/1, but that's kind of okay because it gives you all of this other value. The life you can gain from it really adds up on both sides, and the fact that it comes back with evasion is pretty nice too. It works quite well in green-white too. I think that's one I didn't mention, but it's quite good with Coven because if you curve out, it's easy to get Coven going. You can play this on turn 1. It's just a really nice turn 1 play, one that's going to impact the game immediately and continue to throughout the game. It maintains relevance all game long. And I think people should be valuing it a little more than they are. I see these as like 13th, 12th, 13th picks all the time. And, if I'm not in white or thinking about being in white, I don't take it. But I'm surprised routinely to see it around as late as I do. Yes, both sides seem sort of meh, but the fact both of them come together and you pay very little mana for them is a big deal. Next card I want to look at that I think people should value a little more is Flair of Faith. It's probably weird coming from me if you're familiar with my set review content and everything. I'm not usually a big fan of tricks. They have serious problems. The biggest one being that you open yourself up to a 2-for-1 if you're not careful. Your opponent can really just wreck you if you try to cast a trick, and you do have to be a little careful with them. But I said in my set review, and I think it's still true now, Flair of Faith, as far as tricks go, is very nice. If you end up in green-white especially, you're just going to look at your deck and have 15 humans in it, and when you have that many humans in your deck, this card is pretty amazing. Again, you do have to be careful with it. But the fact that you can use it both to sort of wreck combat, like your opponent double blocks something or, just blocks something and suddenly your creature wins combat and doesn't die, whether you use it that way or to stop removal, it feels pretty good. And it's nice, not all tricks out there have this additional mode where they stop virtually all removal in the set. It doesn't stop exile, of course, but it stops pretty much everything else. And that's a big deal because it makes it way more flexible than your typical trick. It is especially good in green-white, which is, a fairly aggressive deck that's attacking all the time and going wide and all sorts of stuff like that. But it's pretty reasonable in red-white too. I don't love it quite as much in decks like black-white, decks that have a little more going on than just sort of wanting to turn their creatures sideways. It definitely gets worse. This trick is still optimal if you're using it when you're attacking. And, if you're not a deck that's doing a lot of that and doing it early and often, it's not that good. But if you're in green-white, I'm pretty happy generally to have 2 to 3 of these in my green-white decks, and it really never disappoints. Again, be a little careful about when you play it. If you look up and your opponent has 4 cards in their hand and 5 mana available, probably not the right time to use it. But if you pick your spots with it, it's very effective. Next card I want to look at is Shipwreck Sifters. This card has kind of impressed me. I didn't love it when I first saw it, mostly because I was sort of thinking, do I really want to be discarding one of these cards one of these spirits, even if it has Disturb, do I want to be discarding it in a world where that means I don't get both halves of the card? You know what I mean? But it turns out there are enough times where you do, in fact, feel like discarding one of them. It's the most common with Bait Hook Angler, where you don't care that much if you don't get the first half. But there are, others out there, like the 1 mana 1/1 we just talked about. Things that if you discard them and you only get one half, it's not a big deal. And you have to keep in mind you're also looting and you're also making the sifters bigger. And you don't have to discard a spirit. You can just play a 2 mana 1/2 with a loot effect, which is passable. But overall, especially in blue-white, and to a lesser extent, blue-black, I've really liked Shipwreck Sifters in those decks. It's often a 2 mana 2/3, which is size that's pretty significant in this format at that stage of the game. And the card filtering and potential graveyard upside it can give you is pretty nice. And, for a lot of these cards, I'm not saying any of them are like incredible for the most part. I don't think any of the cards on this list here are incredible. But they're all cards I'm seeing people pass on playing or, leave around in the draft until much later than I feel like they should be. And if there's a blue-white drafter on the table and they're getting all these Shipwreck Sifters wheeling, they're going to be really happy because it's a pretty nice enabler for the deck. All right, let's talk now about Blood Tithe Collector. Of the cards on this list, this might be the one that I think is the best. There's a couple others that could be contenders here. But in terms of, this isn't just a card I'm seeing go sort of late, and I think people should be playing a bit more in the right deck. With Blood Tithe Collector, I think we're looking at a legitimately good card that you kind of hope you don't first pick, but you kind of can in some weaker packs. It just has a very reasonable floor and a pretty nice ceiling. I mean, it's not unusual for this to be a 5 mana 3/4 that makes them discard a card, and with flying, obviously. And when it's doing that, it feels incredible. And it's not always going to do it. I mean, I'm not trying to say it's always going to be that. If it was always that, it would be a very good card, one that you do first pick with regularity. But that isn't what it does. However, it's not that hard to find a spot within the game where it does its thing. And I think, generally, when you play Blood Tithe Collector on turn 5, there's probably like a 60% chance your opponent's going to be discarding a card from it. And that's pretty nice. And again, the floor of a 5 mana 3/4 flyer, that's not a great card, but it's one that would make the cut in some decks anyway, even without the upside and even without the useful creature type. So, this is a card I see go really late sometimes, and I'm surprised by it. It's good in all the black decks. Obviously, it's at its best in black-red, which cares about vampires and more triggers like this. But man, I'm pretty happy anytime I can pick up 2 of these. And usually, if I'm in black, I end up picking up a couple of them because for some reason, other people aren't really willing to take them. And it feels pretty good to get these later in packs for me. I'm just surprised to see them there. And I think people will find that it's a pretty good card if they start taking it a little higher. Next, let's look at Covert Cut Purse. So this kind of effect is one that I'm not usually super high on. Hey, your opponent's creature has been damaged and now you can kill it effect. Sometimes you have to give up a whole card to make it happen, so you're not getting like an amazing deal. And more often than sometimes, actually, frequently, you have to sort of attack into something, chump attack into it, and then kill it. Or you have to use a card that does damage and then play, the card that kills the creature that's been damaged. And I don't normally like all the hoops you have to jump through. And it does keep this card from being better than it is, certainly. But what I really like about it is the floor is that it's a 3 mana 2/1, which is a horrible stat line. But the floor is that it's a 3 mana 2/1 that can come back as a 2/2 with flying and death touch, when it disturbs. And that's going to give you a 2-for-1 frequently. And that's sort of the fail case with the card. You have 2 bodies, one of them very good at trading, obviously the Death Toucher. The other one, kind of mediocre at trading, but there are lots of X2s that can block and kill in this format. So the times where you do, in fact, get the trigger to happen, you're kind of getting a 3-for-1. That's what it feels like when you make it happen. It depends on how your opposing creature was damaged, of course. But sometimes you get a real, genuine 3-for-1 out of this, and getting a 2-for-1 out of it isn't that hard. It's not an efficient card by any stretch. No part of it is efficient. But over the course of a game of Limited, getting these 2 separate bodies is a big deal. And I mean, it can also threaten in the air pretty legitimately as a 2/2 flyer. So this card has a lot going on. I'm surprised to see it around as late as I do sometimes. And, it's especially good if you have some Neonates rushes and stuff like that. I've had some black-red decks where that really happened for me, and it was a lot of fun. That's where you really feel like you're getting a 3-for-1. But yeah, it's a pretty good card. Not one you're thrilled about first picking most of the time, maybe, but kind of like the Collector, which I do think the Collector is better, but kind of like the Collector, you can take this first sometimes. And I think a lot of people get hung up on the bad stat line and on the ETB trigger being so conditional. But if you think about the fail case being a 2-for-1 and the upside being a 3-for-1, you're talking about something that's pretty nice, even if its efficiency isn't incredible. Next up, let's talk about No Way Out. So this is another one where if you're used to my set reviews and how high I am or low I am, really, on discard spells, you might be surprised to hear me, have this on a list of cards I think people should play more. But I legitimately think it should be. Part of it is that it gives you a zombie token, and that's something that both blue-black, especially blue-black, but also black-white to a lesser extent, really, really love. And it's attached to an effect that's already, a semi-playable card, Mind Rot. Mind Rot's like a D+ in a lot of formats, if that's all it is, if that's all the card's doing. It depends on the format, of course. You do get a 2-for-1. This is a card that creates a 2-for-1 because you play one card and your opponent loses 2. But some of the problem that this card has in other formats sometimes is that your opponent doesn't, especially as the game gets later, they just don't have things to discard. But I don't find that happening that often in this format because there's so much stuff we can do with cards in our graveyard. People end up doing those things because they need to, or it's the most efficient play to make, and they hold on to cards in their hand more. And you might be saying also, well, but what if they discard cards with Flashback and Disturb? And yeah, that's a thing, but you are still taking away some value from them by not giving them the front half of the card, the front part of the card, the part where they cast it from their hand, and you're still getting a zombie token. Now, don't get me wrong, this card's not great. If you have better ways of generating zombie tokens in your blue-black deck, this often does get cut. It's like a C-. I mean, it's not a great card, but I think people are avoiding it like it's, a D or a D+, as Mind Rot often is. But it's a pretty decent inclusion in blue-black decks especially. Next up, let's talk about Eccentric Farmer. So this card, I think the secret's out on it to some extent, but I don't think it's out enough. And that secret is that it's really actually quite good. Maybe green's best common, even though it doesn't look like a whole lot. A 3-mana 2/3 that mills you 4 cards and gets you a land. That seems like a solid playable, but not a whole lot more than that, right? But especially in blue-green, this card is kind of a powerhouse and a value engine. Those decks tend to jam a bunch of Flashback and Disturb into them, and various payoffs for doing things from the graveyard. And thus, the farmers help effectively sometimes add cards to your hand. And not just the land you get back, but real cards you get to add to your hand because they have Flashback or Disturb. And it increases your option, gives you, access to those cards much earlier than you would have if you hadn't milled yourself. And the blue-green deck, is at its best when it has multiples of these. And I still find myself able to pretty easily grab 3 or 4 of them. And that's why it's on this list, because I can't believe the number of drafts I've had where I get that many. And they tend to go pretty well. I had one where my curve was really low. It was sort of an aggressive blue-green deck. They don't all end up that way, but this one did. But it had sort of a really low curve, and I had 4 farmers, so I only had to run 15 lands, and I basically had no mana problems because, my deck would find the lands for me, and I'd get them back into my hand every time I played a farmer. And so, between my low curve and the farmers, I didn't have to run that many lands, which is always pretty nice because, you have more action in your deck than your opponent generally will, if that's the case. So yeah, I think the secret's out on this. I think people know it's pretty good, but I think people need to start thinking of it as maybe green's best common. And I keep saying maybe. The only reason I say maybe is because it's not nearly as good outside of blue-green. It's kind of a build-around really good common, so it's less like an amazing common that you like really want to first pick or something like that than it would otherwise be. But in that deck, in that blue-green deck, it's amazing. And you should think of that upside when you see it in drafts and think about what you can do with it. And even in other decks, it's fine. But in that deck, it's just obscene the amount of value it can give you for a common. On a similar note, the next card I want to look at is Winterthorn Blessing. This is a card that seems also to, not be really high in most people's pick orders. But if you're in that blue-green Eccentric Farmer deck, and especially if you're in a more aggressive one, which can happen, and this is one reason to go a little more aggressive, Winterthorn Blessing is amazing. Just casting one side of it from your hand can often really alter a race significantly, and for only 2 mana. And there are times where you can cast both parts of it, tap down 2 things, attack your opponent in a way that just wasn't possible before, because A, they had way better, they had good blockers that would have made the attack hard, or because B, they could swing back at you for lethal. But this card makes sure neither of those things matter. Winterthorn Blessing does a thing all game long, really altering races, making your creatures bigger. And it is, a pretty big powerhouse, a card that really alters games significantly anytime you cast it or flash it back or do both. It's one of the powerful reasons to be in blue-green is Winterthorn Blessing. You can even just mill it, and flash it back later. I've had a lot of fun with it here late in the format as I've gotten sort of higher and higher on the blue-green deck. And I think, valuing this a little more highly will result in, you having some more powerful blue-green decks especially. Another card I want to look at is Timberland Guide. This is a card I see like as the 14th or 15th card in a pack way too often. Don't get me wrong, it's nothing special, but it's a perfectly solid playable, especially in green-white. The reason being that it gives you a 1/1 and a +1/+1 counter, and it's sort of customizable, right? Where you put that counter, whether you make it a 2/2 or whatever. And having these sorts of effects that put counters on things when they enter the battlefield is a really good way to set up Coven. Like this on its own can contribute 2/3 of Coven if there's one other thing to put a counter on. It's really a nice thing to set up Coven. And then you have a fail case of a card that is a 2 mana 2/2, which, that's reasonable. But it already has the upside. Even if you strip the Coven upside away from this, the fact that it helps you set up Coven quickly and in the early game, which is generally what you want to do, you also have to think about the fact that it actually stays kind of relevant all game long. Even in a regular green deck that isn't a green-white deck, any other green deck, it comes down and it puts a counter somewhere. And oftentimes in the later part of games, as we all know, sticking a counter somewhere suddenly makes it so a creature can attack that just couldn't before. You can put it on a much more relevant body that has keyword abilities like, flying and things like that. And that really gives it some nice utility late. Again, it's not a great card. There are lots of 2-drops you'd rather play than this thing, but it should not be like the 14th or 15th card in packs at all. It's not remotely that bad. It is a very solid common to be playing in green decks and especially in green-white. And the last card I want to talk about that I think people should consider playing a bit more is Lamholt Harrier. This is kind of like Timberland Guide in the sense that, this card's not good, probably, but it's a card I see as like the last pick in packs way too often. It's a 2 mana 2/2 with fairly costly upside, but the upside it gives you does actually come up. You'll find in later parts of games that it really alters the combat math. Your opponent has to think about, well, what happens if they make one of our blockers unable to block, or 2 of them if it's the extreme late game. It's not a great ability for the cost, but as games sort of go on, it often increases a little bit in power because it can really alter races, and break up parity and things like that. It does have the unfortunate problem of being a wolf, in a format where like the red-green deck and red in general have overall been sort of disappointing in terms of, how strong they are. And that's one reason why it's around kind of late, even though it's not a terrible card. But I still don't think it should be around quite that late. In any deck that's red and aggressive, it's a fine thing to include. Generally, most frequently, it means red-green and red-white are where you're going to find yourself playing it. You don't really want it in blue-red, for example. But it's fine in those 2 decks. And, a card that should be making the cut, as a 22nd, 23rd card, instead of being a card that's like the 14th pick in a pack, which is just not where it should be. All right, so those are my picks for 10 cards people should be playing more of in Midnight Hunt Limited. We'll close out this edition of Nizzanotes with another Crack-A-Pack. It might actually be our last Crack-A-Pack of this format because I think next week I'm sort of going to do a format review, not in the sense of reviewing the cards, but how good I think this limited format was. So I think we'll probably be skipping a Crack-a-Pack from here on out, and then we'll sort of move into Crimson Vow time and be cracking Crimson Vow packs. So this might be our last pack of this set for us to look at and talk about. And yeah, that's what I'll do. Show you a pack one, pick one scenario, talk about which card I would pick and all the cards in general, how I see them fitting into the format and so forth. All right, so here's our pack. We'll go starting with the commons. Our first one's Bird Admirer. This card, in a lot of the green decks, especially sort of the grindier ones, like the blue-green deck that's a little grindier and slower, it's a nice thing to have around. It's a pretty effective blocker. You don't really want it in any of the more aggressive decks most of the time. It's kind of all right in green-white, but it's definitely at its best in a deck like blue-green, which is probably the most defensive of the green decks in this format, and it's a nice fit there. Certainly not something you want to first pick. Crawl from the Cellar, been a nice comment, especially for blue-black, where you can rebuy your Siege zombie or other zombie that has an important activated ability to abuse your tokens, and then you also make something in play, gain a counter, and then you can do it again. It's very nice in that deck, okay in other black decks, but certainly not something you want to first pick. Next up, it's Stuffed Bear. You know how I feel about that. It's unplayable. It is a card that should be a 14th or 15th card left behind. Neonates Rush. This is a card I sort of considered including on 10 cards you should play more, because I see YouTube comments on my video why are you playing Neonates Rush? It's terrible. And it's just not. But I do generally think it's valued how it should be within drafts that I've played on Magic Arena. It's not around super late or anything crazy. What I like about it is it fits really well in blue-red because it's a spell that's a cantrip, and obviously in black-red, the color pair that cares about damaging the opponent, and it obviously costs less if you have vampires, so it's a nice card in both. Still not something you want to take remotely early. Bounding Wolf, if you need some reach in a green deck, it does it. Bird Admirer is basically a better version of it, though, so you usually don't play it. Duress, you don't want to take this early. It's an okay sideboard card if you're playing best of 3. If you're playing best of 1, you just shouldn't play it. There aren't enough cards that it'll hit in your opponent's hand. It'll just basically make you mulligan a little too often. Component Collector, this thing's fine, especially in more defensive decks generally, because you can sort of slow their roll while you try to grind value out of your graveyard or whatever. Not a card you even always play, and really only good in blue-red and blue-green, but it is fine, in both of those places. Secrets of the Key, this thing's fine, especially in blue-green. If you don't cast the first part of it, from your hand to get the 1 clue, it's not a big deal. So when you mill it, with your milling cards in the blue-green deck, it's kind of the kind of card where milling it feels pretty good, and you can just flash it back and get those clues. Still, we're not talking about anything so far that's something I ever want to first pick. So our commons so far are pretty weak. Next up, we've got Startle. This is a decent card. When it does everything it can do, which is make you win combat and kill an opposing creature, as well as give you the zombie and draw you a card, it feels pretty absurd. But more often than not, it just ends up sort of helping you block a creature, but not actually kill it, since you're not weakening its toughness at all. It does kill things sometimes, like I said, and that's when it feels great. But more often than not, it doesn't, and it's just an okay card, especially in blue-black, but also blue-red. Ritual Guardian, this is a fine thing. It's not exactly the card with Coven you're hoping for in your green-white deck, but, gaining lifelink is nice value to have, and it's going to have it reasonably often, and it's definitely a solid playable. But I don't really want any of these commons. Let's see. If I had to take one of these commons here out of this pack, I'd probably take Neonates Rush or Crawl from the Cellar, I guess. They're both pretty quality cards in multiple decks. And I guess that's probably where I'd go. But it's a pretty weak pack in terms of the commons. Let's see if it gets better with uncommons. First uncommons, Defend the Celestis. So this thing's all right. It is an expensive trick, and those are even more dangerous. Gets around that a little bit because it lets you distribute the counters, so your opponent can't just kill one thing and blow you out. But 4 mana is a lot to leave up for a trick like this. It does potentially help you get Coven, but there are better ways to do it. Things that add to the board while also giving you counters and helping you get Coven, like Timberland Guide, and things like that, and Defend the Celestis. I just don't like it that much. You play it sometimes for sure, but I would definitely take Crawl from the Cellar or Neonates Rush. probably Ritual Guardian as well over it out of this pack. Probably Bird Admirer also. So that tells you something. All right, Dawnheart Mentor. We're finally at a card now that doesn't feel kind of bad to first pick. Speaking of cards that help you get Coven and add to the board at the same time, that's what the Mentor does. It gives you a 0/4. 0 is a good power for Coven because there's so few cards with 0 power. And then it adds a 1/1 to the board. And so those two bodies can sometimes just turn on Coven immediately, depending what your board looks like. Like if you have a Ritual Guardian out there, you have Coven all of a sudden. And then she, of course, comes with the ability to do Coven things. And her ability is expensive. But if you attack and have mana for that ability up, your opponent is in a bad place. Like they really have to find... usually, you just have to take it because blocking it could turn into a complete train wreck. Depending on, what you use it on and things like that. So Mentor, definitely something I would first pick and be pretty happy about. Mysterious Tome, less so. It's an all right card. I had really high hopes for it. I'm going to be doing my what I got wrong video at some point in the near future. And the tome's going to be on it because I think I gave it like a B, which is kind of laughable. But, one side of it is Icy Manipulator-like, and that got me pretty excited. And the other side draws you a card pretty efficiently. But the problem is, a lot of the time, the way I looked at it didn't take into account how often you would want the other side to stick around. And frequently you find yourself in situations where you don't want the card or you don't want to tap a creature. You want the card. And so that ends up making this kind of clunky and not a card that I love. So yeah, Dawnheart Mentor definitely our pick so far. But we have a really good rare. We have Light Up the Night. It's basically an improved Blaze, which is very good. X and a red to do X damage to something is quite powerful. And this gets a little bit of a boost because if you target a creature with it, you pay 1 less mana. So whatever amount you put into X is the amount of damage you'll do. Actually, plus the other mana you spend. So it's more than the amount in X. So if you pay 4 mana total, it does 4. That's what I'm trying to say. The flashback basically never happens. I mean, there's not very many planeswalkers. They're all mythic rare. I've never seen it happen. I'm sure it has on some rare occasions, but it's really not even that potent because you have to do damage equal to loyalty counters, but that doesn't matter at all. It's a great removal spell and a good finisher, and it's definitely our first pick here, followed by the Mentor. And then everything else in this pack is significantly lower down on my pick order. It's a pretty weak pack overall. So whoever gets past this pack for like pick 3 is going to be like, what the heck was in this pack and how is it this bad? But that happens sometimes. That's limited for you. All right, so that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. Like I said, next week I'm going to come back and talk about things I liked, things I didn't like about this format. Sort of review it as a limited format, how much fun it was, etc., how well designed it was, and that's what we'll be doing next time. So tune in for that. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss that episode or any of the other content I put out there. If you want to hear me talk more about this format, you should see links to my playlists to my set review and the rest of this series on your screen shortly. If you enjoyed this video too, do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.